A 7-year-old girl in a bright pink dress stepped out of the shadows and offered a cold-blooded mafia boss her lunch money, every cent she owned, to bring her kidnapped mother home. The police had already turned their backs on her. The predatory gang that snatched her mom warned her that if she spoke a word to anyone, she'd never see her mother alive again. Alone and terrified, little Nora R. Donahue realized that if the law wouldn't protect her, she had to find someone the law was afraid of. She didn't run or hide. Instead, she walked straight up to Kenji Alanez Koto, a man whose very name makes grown men tremble, and offered him a handful of coins to hire his protection. Her bodyguards froze in shock, watching a man of pure apathy confront a child of pure innocence. What Nora said next forced Kenji to shatter his own code of silence, sparking a high-stakes war that would transform a ruthless predator into the neighborhood's only true guardian. The heavy door of the black sedan clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Kenji Alanez Koto adjusted his cufflinks, his mind already drifting to the logistics of the shipping ports, when a small, insistent pressure against his hand stopped him cold. It wasn't the metallic poke of a barrel or the sharp sting of a blade. It was soft. He looked down. A girl stood there, a splash of defiant bright pink against the gray concrete of the east side. Her hair was gathered in messy pigtails, and her eyes were rimmed with the kind of red that only comes from days of silent crying. In her trembling hand, she held a small pile of nickels, dimes, and 2 crumbled singles. "I want to hire you," Nora R. Donahue whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the idling engine. Behind Kenji, the world seemed to tilt. His bodyguards, men who had stared down federal agents and rival hitmen without blinking, froze. Their hands hovered near their holsters, caught in a bizarre limbo between lethal instinct and the sight of a child who couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds. On the sidewalk, a passerby gasped, clutching a grocery bag as if waiting for the explosion. Kenji didn't signal his men to move. Instead, he did something that caused the air to leave the lungs of everyone watching. He lowered himself, his expensive wool trousers pressing into the grime of the pavement, until he was at eye level with her. "Hire me?" Kenji's voice was like velvet over gravel, calm, intense, and terrifyingly focused. "Do you know who I am, Nora?" She didn't look away, though her lip trembled. "Mrs. Murphy said the police won't go where the bad men live. She said you own the streets. She said if I wanted my mom back, I had to give you everything I had." She thrust the lunch money closer. "It's $4.50. I didn't eat for 3 days to save it. Please, they took her in a van." Kenji looked at the coins. He dealt in millions, in territory, in life and death. The small change looked absurd in his calloused palm. Yet, as he watched a single tear finally escape and track through the dust on her cheek, the icy detachment he had cultivated for 20 years cracked. He saw the bruises on her small wrists, grip marks. "The bad men," Kenji said, his eyes darkening with a sudden, predatory heat. "Did they tell you what would happen if you talked?" "They said she'd never come home," she choked out. "But you're the boss of the bad men, aren't you? You can make them stop." Kenji reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he gently closed her tiny fingers over the money. "Keep your gold, Nora. A contract with me is signed in a different way." He stood up, the warmth leaving his face as he turned to his men. The bodyguards straightened instantly, their faces turning into stone masks. "Tony, find out which crew is snatching women in my zip code. Marco, get the car. We're going to work." Kenji remained crouched on the cold pavement, his expensive Italian shoes ignored as he focused entirely on the small girl and the bright pink dress. He didn't take the money, but he didn't pull away either. The silence on the street was absolute, broken only by the distant siren of a city that had long ago forgotten people like Nora Donahue. $4.50, Kenji repeated, his voice low and devoid of its usual lethal edge. That's a lot of money for a girl your age, Nora. Nora nodded, a stray pigtail bobbing against her neck. I saved it, since Tuesday. She looked down at the crumpled bills, her knuckles white. I didn't buy the milk at school, and I didn't get the crackers. I hid the money in my shoe so the bad men wouldn't find it when they came back to the apartment. The image of a 7-year-old girl starving herself for 3 days, shivering in a dark apartment while hiding coins in her sneaker, hit Kenji harder than any physical blow. He felt the eyes of his bodyguards on his back, men who were used to seeing him command millions in untraceable cash. To them, the $4 was invisible. To Nora, it was her life's savings, a desperate ransom for the only person she had left. Why me, Nora? Kenji asked. There were people with badges and sirens just a few blocks away. A flash of weary, adult-like frustration crossed her face. They came, she whispered, her eyes finally meeting his. The men with the blue lights. They looked at our empty fridge and my mom's old bills. They said she probably just left because things were hard. She swallowed a sob that threatened to break her voice. But my mom wouldn't leave me. She was making spaghetti. She left the stove on. You don't leave the stove on if you're leaving. She leaned in closer, the scent of lavender soap and fear clinging to her. Mrs. Murphy said you're the one who makes the bad men disappear. She said you don't need a badge to be the boss. Please, Mr. Kodo, I don't have any more lunch money left, but I can work. I can clean your car. I just want my mama back. Kenji looked at the coins again. In the world of the East Side, $4.50 bought nothing. But looking into Nora's unwavering brown eyes, he realized it had just bought the most expensive thing in his world, his conscience. You've paid enough, Nora, Kenji said, finally standing up. He didn't take the money. Instead, he gently pushed her small hands back toward her pockets. The contract is accepted. Now I need you to go back to Mrs. Murphy's. Tell her Kenji Alani's Kodo has the watch. As she turned to run, her pink dress a blur against the gray city, Kenji's face hardened into a mask of pure, focused violence. The bad men had made a mistake. They had stolen a mother, but they had accidentally hired a ghost. The heavy door of the Cadillac closed with a muffled thud, sealing Kenji inside a world of quiet leather and cold intentions. Outside, Nora had vanished into the shadows toward Mrs. Murphy's, but her presence lingered in the air like the scent of ozone before a storm. Kenji didn't speak. He simply stared at the $4.50 resting on the console, the crumpled bills slowly unfolding as if gasping for air. Tony, Kenji said, his voice a low vibration that made the rearview mirror tremble. Tony, sitting in the passenger seat, didn't need a clarification. He had been Kenji's eyes on the street for a decade. It's a group calling themselves the Iron Dogs, boss. Recent arrivals. They've been operating out of the old industrial strip on the north edge. We thought they were just small-time boosters, car parts, warehouse pilfering. We ignored them because they weren't worth the ammunition. Kenji's eyes remained fixed on the coins. They aren't boosting parts anymore, Tony. They're boosting people. The car moved through the east side, the neon lights of the storefronts blurring into long, jagged streaks of red and blue. As they drove, the reality of the violation began to set in. Kenji had ruled this territory for 15 years on a singular, unwritten code. Business was business, but the neighborhood was a sanctuary. You could run numbers, you could move cargo, but you did not prey on the hands that fed you. You did not touch the families. They've taken 3 in the last month, Marco added from the driver's seat, his hands tight on the wheel. A shopkeeper's son, a delivery driver, and now Nora's mother. They aren't asking for the kind of money we deal in. They're looking for neighborhood ransoms, 5, 10, 20,000, amounts that break a family but don't draw the feds. A business model built on desperation, Kenji whispered. The Iron Dogs had mistaken his restraint for weakness. They thought they could turn his streets into a hunting ground because he had been too busy looking at the horizon to notice the rats at his feet. They had violated the peace, turned mothers into commodities, and left 7-year-old girls to starve in the dark. Kenji reached out and picked up one of Nora's dimes. It was cold and small. "They think because they're playing for pennies they're beneath my notice," he said, his voice dropping to a predatory silkiness that chilled the air in the car. "They think there are no rules in the gutter. They're about to find out that the East Side has only one rule. I am the peace, and when you break the peace, you meet the storm." He looked at the digital clock on the dash. Midnight was approaching. "Gather the captains. I want the Iron Dog's location by the time we hit the restaurant. Tonight, we don't collect interest. We collect debts." The back room of L'Eclisse was usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations and silent counting of illicit gains. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different, weighted not by greed, but by a cold, surgical intent. Kenji stood at the head of a long mahogany table, the $4.50 in lunch money resting directly under the glow of a low-hanging lamp. His captains and specialists filed in, their faces carved from granite, their eyes reflecting the hard-earned weariness of men who lived in the shadows. There was no shouting, no bravado. These were Kenji's shadow army, men who functioned more like a scalpel than a sledgehammer. Usually, they gathered to discuss supply chains or territory disputes, but as they looked at the crumpled singles and the small pile of change on the table, a collective heavy silence settled over the room. "Tonight is not about the books," Kenji said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "A child walked up to me on the street. She hasn't eaten in 3 days. She gave me this change to buy her mother's life back." Tony passed around a dossier of grainy photographs. They weren't shots of rival bosses or drug shipments. They were surveillance photos of the Iron Dog's industrial hideout and the faces of the low-level predators who had been snatching mothers and shopkeepers. The enforcers leaned in, their expressions shifting from professional detachment to something sharper, more jagged. They saw the violation for what it was, not a challenge to their business, but an insult to the ground they stood on. Marco began checking the action on his suppressed sidearm, the mechanical click echoing like a heartbeat in the still room. Behind him, 2 specialists were unfolding a tactical map of the North Edge Strip, marking entry points and sentry positions with red ink. These men had conducted hits that shifted the power balance of the city, yet they moved now with a specialized kind of reverence. They weren't just enforcers tonight. The no kids, no families rule was the only thing that separated them from the animals they hunted. To see that rule broken by the Iron Dogs ignited a dormant spark of old-world honor. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying efficiency, loading specialized gear into the trunks of black SUVs and checking encrypted comms. "No survivors among the dogs," Kenji commanded, his gaze sweeping over his silent army. "We are the monsters that keep the other monsters away. Tonight, we remind them why the East Side belongs to us." As the men stood and filed out toward the garage, there was no chatter, only the grim, purposeful sound of heavy boots on hardwood. They were a shadow army moving into the light of a righteous war, and for the first time in years, they weren't fighting for a percentage. They were fighting for a little girl in a pink dress. The basement of the old textile mill smelled of damp concrete and ancient, rotting dust. Rosa Donahue sat on a rusted metal chair, her wrists bound behind her with coarse zip ties that bit into her skin every time she took a ragged breath. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, skeletal shadows against the weeping walls. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow, freezing terror that had settled in her chest 3 days ago. Every time the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs creaked, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't fear the men who came down, the Iron Dogs with their hollow eyes and cruel laughter. She feared what they weren't telling her. Her mind was a relentless loop of images. Nora coming home to an empty kitchen, the pot of spaghetti sauce she had been stirring now a dried, moldy ruin on the stove. The front door left wide open to a neighborhood that preyed on the small. "Please," she had begged the leader, a man with a jagged scar across his throat during the first night. She's only 7. She doesn't know how to use the stove. She's afraid of the dark." The man had only laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Then she better learn fast, shouldn't she? Or maybe she'll find someone else to take care of her. We get a good price for the young ones, too." Now, in the suffocating silence of the third night, Rosa closed her eyes and prayed. It wasn't a prayer for her own life. That felt forfeit the moment they shoved her into the van. It was a mother's desperate plea for a miracle. She pictured Nora's bright pink dress, the one she had painstakingly mended just last week. She imagined her daughter hiding under the bed, clutching her tattered teddy bear, waiting for a mother who might never return. "Be brave, Nora," she whispered into the dark, her voice cracking. "Find a way. Please, baby, find a way." She didn't know about the $4.50 in lunch money. She didn't know about the man in the expensive suit kneeling on a dirty sidewalk, or the shadow army currently checking their silencers in a garage only miles away. All she knew was the crushing weight of her own helplessness. She slumped forward, her forehead resting against the cold metal of a support beam, as a single tear traced a path through the grime on her face. She felt the world narrowing down to this dark room, unaware that the silence of the night was about to be shattered by the sound of a debt being collected in full. The 3 black SUVs glided through the rusted skeleton of the industrial district like predators moving through tall grass. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, only the low, rhythmic hum of high-performance engines. Kenji sat in the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the crumbling facade of the old steel mill. He didn't check his weapon. He had men for that. He simply adjusted his silk tie, his mind as cold and focused as a winter morning. The vehicles coasted to a halt 100 yards from the perimeter. Door latches clicked open in perfect unison, and the shadow army spilled out. They moved with a terrifying, practiced grace, black tactical gear blending into the soot-stained shadows of the mill. Marco signaled the 2 snipers who vanished into the heights of an adjacent grain elevator, their suppressed rifles scanning for the Iron Dog's sentries. A muffled thwip, thwip echoed through the night air, the sound of the perimeter guards being neutralized before they could even reach for their radios. Kenji stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching softly under his polished shoes. He followed the breach team as they reached the heavy steel side door. Tony placed a small specialized charge on the hinges. Click. The door didn't explode. It simply gave way with a heavy groan as the enforcer shouldered it open. They entered the mill in a diamond formation, their weapon lights cutting through the thick, swirling dust in sharp, blinding needles. The air inside tasted of grease and old sweat. From the upper catwalks, an Iron Dog shouted a confused warning, but his voice was cut short by a precision shot from the shadows below. The raid was a symphony of controlled violence. Kenji's men moved room to room, clearing the space with surgical efficiency. There was no shouting, only the sharp, rhythmic barks of suppressed gunfire and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the concrete. The Iron Dogs, used to bullying the weak and the desperate, were utterly unprepared for a professional military-style erasure. They scrambled in the dark, tripping over their own feet as the shadow army closed the circle around them. Kenji walked through the chaos as if he were strolling through a gallery. He ignored the panicked pleas of the gang members being zip-tied or neutralized. His eyes were searching for a specific door, the one leading to the basement. He reached the heavy iron hatch at the center of the floor, where the leader of the Iron Dogs stood trembling, a pistol shaking in his hand. "You're in the wrong neighborhood, boy," Kenji said, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls with the weight of a death sentence. He didn't wait for a response. He nodded to Marco, and the final breach began. The basement door was kicked off its frame, and the light finally spilled into the darkness where Rosa Donegal lay waiting. The basement air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the smell of ozone from the flashbangs. Kenji stepped over the threshold, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the concrete floor, a sound that cut through the whimpering of the remaining Iron Dogs. At the center of the room, illuminated by a single swaying bulb, stood the leader of the gang. He was pinned against a rusted support beam by Marco's forearm, his face a mask of sweat and terror. Kenji didn't look at the prisoner first. His eyes drifted to Rosa, who was being gently shielded and untied by Tony in the corner. Only when he saw the slight nod from his enforcer, the signal that she was unharmed, did Kenji turn his full attention to the man with the scarred throat. The gang leader tried to find his voice. His eyes darted toward the stairs where his crew lay neutralized. "Goto, listen," he wheezed. "This was just a small play. We didn't know she was yours. We can settle this. I've got $20, maybe $30,000 stashed upstairs. It's all yours, a tribute. Just let us walk." Kenji reached into his inner breast pocket. The room went silent. He didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he withdrew the small, crumpled wad of singles and the handful of coins. He stepped forward until he was inches from the man, the height of his authority making the basement feel like a cage. He tossed the money onto a nearby scarred wooden table. The coins skittered and rang out like tiny hollow bells. The $4.50 lay there, looking pathetic and small under the harsh light. "You're trying to buy your life with $30,000? Kenji asked, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. "You're overvaluing yourself. This is the only currency that matters tonight." He pointed at the lunch money. "This is a contract. It was paid for in 3 days of hunger by a 7-year-old girl. It was signed with the tears of a child you left in the dark." The gang leader looked at the coins, his mouth hanging open. For $4? You're burning down my whole operation for lunch money?" "I'm burning it down because you forgot the rules of the soil you walk on," Kenji replied, his eyes turning into voids of black ice. "Business is about profit. Justice is about debt. And tonight, your debt is more than you can ever pay." Kenji turned his back on the man, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He didn't need to stay for the end. As he walked toward Rosa to escort her out of the tomb, he spoke one last time over his shoulder to Marco. "The girl paid for a permanent solution. Make sure the neighborhood knows the contract has been fulfilled." Behind him, the leader of the Iron Dogs began to scream, but the sound was quickly swallowed by the shadows of the mill. Kenji didn't flinch. He simply reached out a hand to the trembling woman in the corner, his expression softening just enough to show the man he used to be. "Come, Rosa. Your daughter is waiting." The first rays of a bruised purple dawn were beginning to bleed over the jagged skyline of the east side when the black sedan pulled onto Nora's street. The neighborhood was eerily silent, the kind of stillness that exists only when the world is waiting for a sign that the night is truly over. Kenji stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate. His suit was still sharp, but his eyes bore the weight of the hours spent in the dark of the steel mill. Nora was sitting on the top step of the tenement building, wrapped in a blanket that Mrs. Murphy must have provided. When the car door closed, she stood up, her small frame silhouetted against the peeling paint of the doorway. She didn't run at first. She simply watched him, her breath hitching in the cold morning air. Then, the rear door of the car opened again. Rosa Donahue stepped out, trembling and weary, but alive. The scream that left Nora's throat wasn't one of fear, but of a soul being put back together. The girl plummeted down the stairs, her bright pink dress a flash of color in the gray morning, and collapsed into her mother's arms. Kenji stood by the fender, watching the reunion with a face of stone, though his hand remained tucked in his pocket, gripping the small weight he had carried all night. After a long moment, Kenji approached. The mother looked up at him, her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it bordered on terror. She started to speak, to offer thanks, but Kenji silenced her with a subtle lift of his chin. He looked down at Nora, who was clutching her mother's waist as if she would never let go. "Nora," he said softly. The girl looked up, her face tear-stained but radiant. Kenji reached out and took her hand, turning it palm up. He reached into his pocket and placed the wad of crumpled singles and the handful of coins back into her small grip. "Your contract is fulfilled," Kenji said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "But I don't take lunch money from my neighbors. Consider this a refund for services rendered." "But you did it," Nora whispered, looking at the money. "You saved her." "I did," Kenji replied, standing tall and adjusting his coat. "But you were the one who hired me. And in this neighborhood, the first lesson is that the boss always looks out for his own." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, thick card with nothing but a gold-embossed crest on it. No name, no number. He handed it to Rosa. If anyone ever breathes in your direction again, show them this. It means you're under the protection of the Alanized Kodo family, permanently. Without waiting for another word, Kenji turned and stepped back into the shadows of his car. As the sedan pulled away, he looked through the tinted glass one last time. Nora was standing on the sidewalk, waving a small, tired hand, her $4.50 clutched tight. For the first time in 15 years, Kenji didn't feel like a predator watching his territory. He felt like a man who finally knew what his power was actually for. 10 years had passed, but the air in Kenji Alani's Kado's office still carried the same scent of expensive cedar and old secrets. The city outside had changed. Skyscrapers had risen where warehouses once rotted, and new names sought to carve their marks into the east side. But Kenji remained the anchor. He sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, his hair now silvered at the temples, looking over a ledger of the docks. His eyes drifted from the numbers to the corner of his desk. There, framed in simple, unadorned gloss, was a piece of paper that didn't belong in the office of a man who dealt in shadows. It was a drawing, the colors faded but the intent still vibrant. It depicted a tall man in a dark suit holding the hand of a woman and a small girl in a bright pink dress. Underneath, in the shaky, determined script of a 7-year-old, were the words, "Thank you for being the hero." Kenji reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. He remembered that night with a clarity that the years couldn't dull. He remembered the weight of the $4.50 in his palm, and the way it had felt heavier than any briefcase of gold he had ever carried. That night hadn't just saved Rosa Donahue, it had salvaged the part of Kenji that he thought had been buried under 15 years of cold pragmatism. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Tony, older now but still as silent as a ghost, stepped into the room. "She's here, boss, for the anniversary." Kenji nodded, a rare, genuine smile ghosting across his lips. Nora was no longer the trembling child in the torn dress. She was a young woman now, a university student with a bright future that Kenji had quietly ensured remained unobstructed. Every year on this day, she didn't bring flowers or a gift of high value. She walked in, her head held high, and placed a small white envelope on his desk. Kenji didn't need to open it to know what was inside. $4.50 and a note asking him to use it for the next kid who thinks the world is too dark. "How was the law school application, Nora?" Kenji asked, his voice still a low, commanding rumble, but filled with a fatherly warmth. "Accepted," she said, her eyes sparking with the same courage he had seen on that sidewalk a decade ago. "I want to do what you do, Mr. Kato. I want to make sure the rules actually mean something." As she left, Kenji looked back at the drawing on his wall. He had a territory to run and a reputation to maintain, but he knew that his true legacy wasn't written in the fear of his enemies. It was written in the safety of a neighborhood that knew its guardian was watching. He leaned back in his chair, the $4.50 resting safely in his drawer. A reminder that even the most dangerous man in the city could, for one night and for all the years after, be the good guy. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Like the video and subscribe to Syndicate Boss Files for raw, unfiltered stories that don't sugarcoat reality. More powerful stories are on the way.